All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Thank you all for joining us for the final day of Geography Awareness Week. This is one of our favorite weeks of the year. We're all geography and GIS enthusiasts in data services, and we are very excited about talking about the topic of mapping social justice. And we think we have a really exciting panel here for you all to experience and talk with today. So they're going to give brief presentations about their work, and then we will have time for discussion after. So we do ask that you hold all your questions to the end. So before we get started with the panel, um, I just want to mention that, this has been a week full of events, and the other things that have happened this week are workshops. So we've had workshops on ArcGIS Pro, intro to our spatial, geocoding with and network analysis with StreetMap Premium. And after this panel today, there's an introduction to QGIS. So we'd like to introduce ourselves as the data services team. I'm Jennifer Moore. I'm the head of data services. Doris is the social science data curator and GIS librarian, Doris Scott, the fabulous Doris Scott. Everyone on this team is fabulous. So if I don't say fabulous before everyone, it is implied. Molly Webb is our GIS programmer, and Bill Winston is our GIS analyst. And we are data services at WashU, and you can find us at this URL, library.wustl.edu data. Our core services include data analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, data curation, so preparing data for sharing and preservation, data literacy, so understanding how to find, manipulate, understand, communicate with data, data management. One of the most important parts of anything we do with data is management. Data visualization, so communicating with your data, and of course, geographic information systems, there's a typo on there. And this is what we're talking about today. GIS is a big part of what we do here. So if you notice the image changing, we like to think we take data from this state to this state. We have a number of resources available for you to use if you're at WashU, and this guide, in fact, can be found and used by anyone. This is our GIS research guide, and we have a guide that is associated with all of our core services. Just for people who are currently affiliated with WashU, we wanted to make sure you know that we have a lab that it has specialized software to do data analysis, including GIS analysis. And that is in Olin Library and open when the library is open. However, due to current circumstances, it's physically closed, but we are offering remote access to that lab if you need to use any specialized tools for data analysis that we supply. And we'll also just do a plug for the certificate program at WashU. If you are new to geography or GIS and you want to learn, after you hear these amazing presentations, you want to learn to do it yourself, the certificate program is a great option for doing that. And if you have any specific questions about it, Bill Winston is the coordinator of the GIS certificate program, and he can definitely give you any information you need. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our panel. We have John Cruz, who is the data manager at RiseSTL. Caitlin Lee is a writer, researcher, designer, and she's written articles that include mapping for the Riverfront Times. Marguerite Madden is the director of the Center for Geospatial Research at the University of Georgia, and she's also a faculty member there. Dr. Gena Gunn McClendon is the director of voter access and engagement and Gena, I forgot the rest of your title. I'm so sorry, but she is with the Brown School and does amazing work on on voter suppression and engagement and um, access to services for people. And Dr. Geoff Ward is a faculty member in African and African American Studies, American Cultural Studies, and Sociology at WashU. So we've asked each of these people to answer this prompt. Why is it important to map social justice issues, their issue specifically, what data challenges they face in mapping their issue, and how they involve the community in sharing that data with the community. So our first panelist is John Cruz. He, again, the data management coordinator at RiseSTL. He uses geospatial and census data to tell a visual story of what's happening with land use in the St. Louis region, while also tracking neighborhood change indicators. He works with both Rise technical assistant team and the real estate team. And I will hand it over to him for 10 minutes to tell us more about his work. And before John starts, please mute yourself when not speaking.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for that introduction. And looking at the participant list, I'm glad to see some familiar faces. So to those of you who I already know, hello, it's good to see you again. For all the new friends who I'm meeting today, it's lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much for joining here on a beautiful Friday to sit and talk about mapping stuff. And just so everyone knows, I don't have a PowerPoint or anything like that. My goal today is just to kind of hang back and have a conversation with everyone. And I'm really looking forward to the questions that you're going to have in a little bit. A little bit about RISE, for those who aren't familiar. RISE Community Development is we're a regional-based nonprofit. We work in the city and the county, as well as the two Illinois counties across the river, Madison and St. Clair. And we do affordable housing development. That's a big chunk of the work that we do, in addition to technical assistance for smaller nonprofits that might be more neighborhood-based, and consulting services for nonprofits, governments, data services, and a whole other host of stuff that's kind of in that similar vein. If it's community development related, we do it. So taking that to what I do is tie everything together in a way that makes sense for making sure that the data is right, the data is accurate, that we have a lot of strong reflections of the community and the work that we actually do, be it tax credit applications for affordable housing development, or just trying to craft a story, or doing neighborhood comprehensive planning or something like that. So getting a little bit into the questions, when we talk about mapping issues, it doesn't matter what it is that we're talking about. We have these big questions that we're always trying to answer, right? The who, what, where, when, and why. And any kind of geography stuff, GIS stuff, we're all trying to answer the where to put all that other stuff into context. These are complex issues that we're talking about. And the thing with social science, is a lot of you, I'm sure, are going to be aware, is it's not a pure science. It's not something where you say, eureka, we've got this discovery, we figured it out, E equals MC squared, or whatever it might be. We know that it's very different, and it's very hyper local, because a solution that's going to make sense in one community may not make sense in another community. And that's especially true of an area like St. Louis, that has a really well-defined neighborhood structure and really well-defined ways that people identify with where they live, regardless of if it's the city or the county or a suburb or a neighborhood or whatever it might be. So mapping it helps to put all this stuff into perspective in a way that's a little bit easier for people to understand and comprehend. A lot of us are visual learners. A lot of us just have brains that interpret different data differently. So seeing it in a visual format, seeing how things are approximate to one another, seeing what we might miss if we just looked at something in a table or read a narrative about it, really allows us to have that kind of impact that's really, really important for the kind of work that we need to do. What we're all about as GIS practitioners is telling stories, making sure that the data is accurately represented so that people understand what's going on, and that we can use it to accurately drive things like policy and discussions and decision-making, or even just a more in-depth understanding of the places that we live, work, play, and enjoy. Of course, this comes with a tremendous amount of challenges, especially in the St. Louis region. We have a lot of issues around data quality. I also teach a course in the Brown School, the Foundations to GIS course. So if this is something you're interested in and don't have any experience, I'd encourage you to sign up. But something that I really impress upon my students is that when you're going through school and you're learning how to do all this stuff, you get all these really nice data sets that are kind of just ready to go, and you take them and you're learning the software and you're figuring out all the things you can do with it. In the real world, you're going to get data that looks like garbage, data that's not usable, data that has lots of fields that don't make sense. And I tell people that this is the kind of thing that's going to require 80% cleaning and then 20% of actually doing the work. And in St. Louis, we just have a lot of bad data sets. So it takes a lot to clean. It takes a lot to kind of work our way through all of it. And it takes a lot to kind of get to the point where we can even say this is reliable, usable data, and this is something that we can actually map to tell that accurate story. Because at the end of the day, if you want to craft your storytelling around geospatial analysis, the data that's the foundation of it needs to be good. You have to have trust in the people that created it. You have to trust yourself and your methods to get it to the point where it's usable. And you have to make sure that it's really at a place where it's possible to tell the story that you want without straying a little bit too far from the mission that you wanted to get into. And of course, there's a million other concerns as well. Collaboration, people that are gatekeeping data. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that's kind of hard to find, or you don't know who to talk to or anything like that. And it's a lot. It's a really, really tremendous lot. And it's a very, very active kind of mental state to be in when doing this sort of work, because a lot of it's about human connection. It's about knowing who to call and who to talk to and who can help you understand the data that you're working with better, or who might be able to tell you you're looking at the wrong indicator. This is actually more telling. This is the kind of stuff that you need to look at. So having an understanding of what's available and what's out there and who you can collaborate and coordinate with is all really, really challenging. And it's all very much part of what we're trying to do to make sure that all of our work is accurate. A lot of these challenges are things that we're trying to tackle head on with the work that I do with the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance. That's an effort where I'm the co-chair of the steering committee. And we're doing a lot to try to bring a lot of data practitioners in the region around to the same table to just have discussions around what's going on and who's working on what and what kind of data can people get and things like that. And I know there's some people on the participant list that have been involved in that or have been part of it. For everybody else, if that sounds like something you're interested in, I'm going to go ahead and paste the URL right in the chat here. But that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is solve the big data challenges that are facing the St. Louis region. And I'm really excited to hear what everybody else's data challenges are, because we all have the same problem. So I'm interested in seeing kind of where we're aligned and where we all need help. And hopefully we can help each other out, because it really is something that takes a village to get what we need to do done. Involving the community and the kind of work that I do at RISE is tremendously important. And for a lot of us, our favorite data sets are the ACS, right? It's comprehensive, it gives a tremendous amount of information, and it gives us a lot of stuff that we can really, sink our teeth into to say, this is how we feel about telling this story, and this is kind of about what we think is accurate. And then we look at the margins of error and we say, well, this is the population and this is the indicator, and it says that there's 250 people in the census tract that correspond with this data, but the margin of error is 150 people. And you want to scream, right? You go, and you pull your hair a little bit and say, am I even comfortable using this sort of thing? I don't know if it's actually 250 or if it's 150 or if it's 400. It's a big variance, right? It's well beyond the point where we can look at it and say, I feel incredibly comfortable talking about this. So what we do when we have situations like that is we try to incorporate things into our community engagement process, where we're going out and we're talking to everybody. We get behind our desks, from behind our desks in normal times when they're on COVID, we're all kind of stuck working from our kitchen tables. And we go to the community and we say, there's a big difference between what is happening on the ground and what the anecdotal evidence that everybody sees in day-to-day life is, and what the government is telling us is actually going on based on their data sets. And we know, especially in lower income communities and a lot of communities of color and a handful of other places, the response rates on the ACS data are not great. The data quality is not always where it should be. So we know that the data is imperfect. So instead of coming to them and saying, this is what your community looks like, aren't you glad you had us here to come tell you this? We say, this is what the government thinks the data looks like. This is what they think the numbers are. Is this something that you agree with? Do you feel like it makes sense when I tell you this? Are you nodding your head and saying, yeah, that makes sense, that sounds all right? Or are you shaking your head saying these people have no idea what they're talking about? It's not about presenting people with information that's kind of just quantitatively backing up what they already know anecdotally. It's presenting them with something where they can look at it and say, yes, this makes sense. No, this doesn't make sense. Or this is the context for which it truly does make sense. Because the people that are going to understand their communities the best are the ones that are there all the time. They're the ones that know the neighbors. They're the ones that are kind of hanging out on the porches, watching what's going on. They're the ones going to the neighborhood events. They see all the day-to-day ins and outs of what's happening in a community. And it's so important to rely on local community partners, people that are really on the ground, they're living it every single day, who can help put your data into perspective. And there's only so much we can do as data practitioners working with spreadsheets and geospatial information. And yeah, there's so many places anywhere in the world we can just pull down data and make maps, right? It's important for us as social science practitioners to recognize the limitations of that, recognize the need to reach out to other people and talk to them and help to gain a really stronger, more holistic understanding of what the problems are in a certain area, because we want to make sure that our storytelling is accurate and that we don't do the community that we're working in a disservice by presenting information that isn't the way that it should be. We want to make sure that everyone feels respected, feels involved, feels brought to be part of the process. And so having this kind of data back and forth, especially when we do neighborhood planning processes, is really, really helpful for truly getting an understanding of what's going on. And with that, I think I'm just about at time. So I'm going to go ahead and yield back to Jennifer. Thank you all very much. It's been fantastic talking with you all today. I'm hanging out and looking forward to your questions in a little bit.
Thank you, John. Perfect timing. All right. Our next speaker is Caitlin Lee. Caitlin is a researcher, writer, designer, and she is interested in how power structures and in the built environment. Her reporting on the housing choice vouchers and development incentives of St. Louis City can be found in the Atlantic City Lab and the Riverfront Times. I'm going to go ahead and let Caitlin tell you more about her work, and I will pass it over to Caitlin now.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So starting in 2017, I, along with my co-author, reported on a landlord named Nathan Cooper, who has a significant concentration of properties in Southeast St. Louis City. Let's see. We discovered Cooper's business model was one based around the exploitation of tenants, most of which were Black women with children with federally subsidized housing choice vouchers. They're commonly known as Section 8. His structure of profitable design included a bunch of features. If you'd go to the next slide, Jennifer. And the next one, sorry, and one more. So he'd buy declining properties at a low price, make minimal updates, maximize rent to quickly pay off debt. You can go to the next one, thanks. Cooper focused on Section 8 tenants, placing him in a category that housing researcher Eva Rosen calls a voucher specialist. In her study on Baltimore landlords, Eva found that there's strategic sorting and trapping of voucher holders in units where they can be most profitable to landlords. And so for the sake of time, I won't detail the housing conditions or tactics common in Cooper's business, but you can find them in the reports online. I will focus on the mapping process that supported our investigation. I'm going to paste the link to that map in the chat now. Could you go to the next slide, please? So as part of the larger reporting process, I built a database of properties sorted by Cooper's ownership stake in them. To do this, I pulled sources from public databases and submitted sunshine requests. Then I compiled and mapped the list of properties, and the resulting map was published alongside the 2 reports in the Riverfront Times. So let's see. However, before publication, the creation of this map allowed us as reporters to deepen our research in a number of important ways. So it allowed us to dissect Cooper's patterns of growth geographically. So we saw where over the years since 2008, he had accumulated properties in and outside the city and then concentrated ownership in this southeast strip of the city. It also allowed us to review the footprint. Next slide, please. Review the footprint in context with, again, socioeconomic data from the ACS, seeing how concentrations of poverty, foreclosure patterns, Section 8 rental concentrations overlap with this footprint. And then next slide. Perhaps most importantly, it allowed us to door knock tenants for interviews. So similar to what John was saying about it's important to talk with people on the ground, we were door knocking to ask people, next slide, please, how your experience with your landlord had been. You can see, sorry, the last slide. You can see, sorry, 2 slides back, thanks. Here is a concentration in Dutchtown South, where we focused some of our outreach. Let's see, and then 2 slides forward, please. So over the 14 months where we did these investigations, we visited more than 50 properties owned or managed by Cooper and interviewed 32 tenants. These conversations ranged from 10 minutes to more than 10 hours, checking back over time. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this was the first comprehensive list or map of Cooper properties compiled publicly. Lists like these don't exist easily though. Disclosure of ownership isn't required. And so it takes a lot of effort triangulating sources to compile a list to get a snapshot in time like this one. So for example, next slide, please. What if I asked you the question, how would you find out who owns a piece of property on your block? Next slide. And what if when you go to the city's website, the owner is listed as this gobbledygook LLC name with this mailing address that happens to be a post office box. Next slide. So that's what we kept running into with Cooper properties. In response, I created this database or Excel database of LLCs and properties in that we were presuming to be owned or operated by Cooper, and then we triangulated in order to prove that structure next. We did this by using a bunch of public data sets. So using the Missouri Online Business Filing System to look up the LLCs, their public records, documents, and try to understand the relationship between common names that kept coming up. Next slide. We also used data from the assessor's office. We submitted a reappraisal or a sunshine request for reappraisal requests. At the Recorder's of Deeds office, we looked at the signatures on deeds. We kept seeing, again, this repeating post office box address. We talked with tenants asking to get their perspective. We also used the address and property search feature from the city in this process. Next. And because Cooper and the companies that were related to him were getting payments from the housing authorities in the city and county, we also used sunshine requests to confirm relationship there. Next. So the result allowed us to place each of these company names within a relationship to Cooper. So we have ones with properties in the city of St. Louis, and we're able to note whether he had ownership stake in those companies or whether we could only prove so much as he was a property manager. Next, please. So the city itself or offices within it didn't have a comprehensive list of his properties, neither did aldermen or city offices that interacted with him regularly. So after publication, we shared our list with interested public officials and leaders. And while many of them talked to us in our process about the need to address his and others' exploitation of tenants, there was limited policy action, if any, taken by people in power after publication. Next slide, please. However, in August of 2018, Dutchtown South Community Corporation started organizing tenants in their service area, which includes a large segment of Cooper's footprint. Actually, can you go back one slide? So Maisha Johnson, their tenant rights coordinator, told me that they use this map when door knocking. As a result of their efforts at the door, one meeting included, she said, 54 of Cooper's tenants, tenants who previously didn't know the scale of their landlord's ownership in the neighborhood. They were shocked at the scale and realized that they shared experiences with one another. Johnson recounted to me people saying, you know, my basement is leaking. Oh, mine too. I have frequent ER visits from all the mold. Oh, me too. I have lead issues with my kids. Me too. And I think creating this shared space is a huge accomplishment and works to create community in the face of the individualized rental and privatized Section 8 experience. So Cooper and his employees, you can go to the next slide, please. Cooper and his employees have showed up at organizing meetings, taking pictures of license plates and retaliating against tenants. Here's a picture of him being asked to leave outside the Dutchtown meeting space. More recently, organizing efforts have died down due to COVID. Door knocking is difficult at the moment, and while difficult, there's a continued effort to try to connect tenants with legal support and other resources via Dutchtown South's work. Cooper, as a Section 8 landlord, received additional financial support through the CARES Act to reduce rent burden on tenants. And while there's a memorandum on harassing tenants, Johnson relayed that he continues to do so. While Cooper's just one landlord, the system that he uses to his financial benefit, the systems are systematic. Next slide, please. On a large scale, I think this work begs the question whether details of who owns property should be publicly available in a manner that doesn't allow owners to hide behind shell company names. While it would only be a stepping stone to build more collective power, if this information was much more accessible, we could build maps of the largest property owners in a region. We would have more of an understanding of shared experience as residents and tenants, allowing us to hold property owners accountable. I'd love to build a map showing the top 100 property owners in St. Louis City. And, you know, like, what might we learn from these maps about the concentration of wealth, especially in neighborhoods hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis? What about the current COVID crisis? What might we learn? So that's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was wonderful. Just going to advance here. Our next speaker is Dr. Marguerite Madden from the University of Georgia. She's been a researcher for 27 years at UGA in geographic information systems and landscape analysis of vegetation, landscape level human impacts on natural environments, and more recently, collaborative research in animal behavior, wildlife, disease, human geography, and environmental design. I will pass it on to Marguerite to tell you more about her work.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to tell the story about a research project that went on for a couple of years from between 2017 and 2019 that used historical images and maps depicting African American history in Athens, Georgia, which is the town where the University of Georgia is. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Sergio Bernardez, who did the bulk of the work to put this together on the mapping platform. And we involved several students, undergraduates and graduates in the project. Next slide. And just wanted to show you a picture. So I coordinate the work and really involved in steering it, but these are the people that do the work. Next slide. So in 2015, November of 2015, in fact, this is Baldwin Hall, which houses our anthropology department. they decided to do an addition to the building, and when they started to dig up the parking lot, they found a human skull. They brought the police in and determined that it was a very old skull. They started an excavation, and this evolved over time. Next slide. And eventually they found in this lower right yellow box, that's the parking lot which had been dug up, they found 105 graves. So there was a very old cemetery north of the building, and in that area there are tombstones, and at one point the university wanted to put a parking lot there, but a ad hoc group of people, the Old Athens Cemetery Foundation, formed to try to preserve it, and now it is preserved. But you'll see from the next slides that actually this whole block had been used at the Old Athens burial ground to begin with. Next slide. So the excavation continued. The remains were exhumed, and this was at the anthropology and archaeology building, so many of the professors were involved in this work. And when they did DNA analysis on the remains, they found that the majority were of African descent. So this was determined and obvious to be the slave section of the original cemetery. Next slide. So the administrators of the university did involve African-American professors and administrators in the decision, and also following the state archaeology policy of when remains are found, they're moved to the next closest cemetery, trying to keep them in the same order in case there were family members. Any remains that were still intact or physical, put them in boxes and had to move them to the Oconee Hill Cemetery across the street. And they had a ceremony, and put all the remains are interred here. But the controversy was they did not involve the local Athens African-American community. Next slide. So the discussion was, you know, there were people here today who these are probably related ancestors. They might have had other ideas. They might have liked to have brought the remains to their own churches, their own local cemeteries. So there was some criticism about not involving the local community in these decision processes. So the Vice President for Research, Dr. David Lee, he, and this is maybe an administrative methodology to do some research on this. So I proposed a research project that I said we probably cannot identify the individuals of the remains, but maybe we can recreate the environment that they lived in, bring in historical maps and historical images, and at least tell the story of African-American history in our town. Next slide. So we started looking. There's actually a wealth of information right here at UGA. We have a Hargett Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Many different maps were available, and we only pulled out a few of them to add to our database to begin with, and we hope people will continue this. This is actually a hand-drawn map of unknown date. Next slide. But it does show Athens became a town in 1801. And this block that you see the word spring in the middle, this block was designated as the graveyard or the Old Athens burial grounds. People did not own property, but as people passed away, they would be buried in this whole block section. And then to the west, it would be the original UGA campus, starting from 1785. Next slide. So this is one of the early maps. It's actually a recreation of the original map that was redrawn in the 70s, but this is 1874 showing Athens. Next slide. And we also had an 1895 map. Next slide. And we're able to zoom in this block area. So at this point where the blue circle is, This was the area that was noted as being the old Athens cemetery at that time, but the area above it would have been part of the original burial ground. So we don't know. When the commercial buildings were built, did they remove remains then? In the plot that's marked 145, did they remove remains then when people lived there? But this next block, 146, we definitely know there remains there. And at this point in 1874, the old Athens cemetery had been closed to new burials in 1856. So any remains there would have, and any of African descent would have been enslaved people, as well as maybe some freed people. After that, burials were in the Oconee Cemetery in the Red Circle. That was a more modern cemetery where people would own property and own plots and bury on a family basis. Next slide. In 1895, you see the railroad came in and it sliced off a corner of the Oconee Cemetery, Oconee Hill Cemetery. That area was where the pauper section was and the colored section. So again, remains were displaced when the railroad went through. Next slide. And this was a map that was just amazing to me. I'd never seen it before. It's from 1925. It's a blueprint. And so we're looking at that same area in 1925. And next slide. What was most incredible is the land use was designated by symbols as being residential, commercial, industrial, and colored. So this is essentially a red line map for all the world to see and look at these areas with this slanted hash mark designating the areas of African American residents and businesses. And these areas, the outlines of these areas are evident in the land use of this area today. Next slide. So we also put together some historical imagery, and our UGA map library had actually already had these composites dating back to 1934. Next slide. And this is the campus area. So here's that block area in 1934, before Baldwin Hall was built. Next slide. And today. So you see when the building was built in 1938, remains were displaced, and there's some records of the remains being transported outside of Athens to other areas, but they've never been located. But this would have been the slave section of this original bury ground. Next slide. At the time that the Athens Cemetery Foundation was created in the 70s, they drew a hand-drawn map, which is very detailed, of all the tombstones. And this is actually in the white section, and they transcribed the information on all of the monuments. So we have that in our database. Next slide. So when I started my project, I wanted to involve some local high school students. So Azawin and Nicholas Moon had just graduated from Cedar Shoals High School. They started working with the graduate students and helping us to geo-rectify all the maps. So these were the challenges of trying to rectify very old maps and put them into a common database. Next slide. And I'll just go through these quickly. These are involving the students in different, going to get the maps. Next slide. Talking to local historians. Next slide. Aza was very interested in the African-American history of her town. So we have lots of literature about Athens history. Next slide. And she made a story map that was her own ideas and interests of historical places in town. Next slide. And so she looked at what was here today and with the buildings that were removed that were very important in African American history. Next slide. Nicholas was involved in creating digital 3D models of the tombstones. Next slide. And using photogrammetry to make 3D models. Next slide. And we also flew our drone and acquired imagery. Next slide. And this would be a Baldwin Hall. So we made a 3D model that is incorporated into a story map. Next slide. And this is the main communication and interaction with the community. We have the story map that tells the history and shows all of the data and the old maps. We have a map portal where people can go and turn layers on and off and make their own maps and save them as PDFs. They can also download the original data as georeferenced or ungeoreferenced information. And we have a training set of how to use the portal. So go to Athens Layers of Time and you're welcome to explore and use these data yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. That was an amazing presentation. A lot there to think about. Our next presenter is Dr. Gena Gunn McClendon, Director of Voter Access and Asset Building Initiatives at the Center for Social Development. Her work primarily involves policy research analysis and consultation with community-based programs, academic institutions, state and federal policymakers, and advocacy groups. And as you can imagine, Dr. McClendon has been very busy in these last few months with all things elections. So let's hear more from Dr. McClendon. Thank you so much.
Good morning, and I just want to thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me to participate on this amazing panel. I have to tell you before I get started that for me, everything that I do, all the work that I do is through a lens of race, being an African-American woman. So listening to the two presentations before me makes me really understand the importance of mapping for social justice. It's just so important. But anyway, so in thinking about what I was going to say today, Jennifer already talked about that I am a Director of Voter Access and Engagement Initiative. And so the VAE initiative began just with a basic concept note in 2017 after the 2016 election, focusing on voter suppression as a threat to democracy. And that was based on what I saw as an election protection poll monitor during the 2008 election. And so what I saw was voter suppression in real time, long lines, broken machines, lack of election judges, just to name a few. So, and where I was a poll place was in a predominantly Black and low-income neighborhood in North County. So, you know, even years later, I was never able to erase that scene from my mind. To this day, I'm still kind of filled with anger from what I saw. So after that election, the center, we decided to embark on a body of work to try to mitigate these problems using social work as a backdrop to improve voting conditions for the sake of democracy. And so that's kind of how VAE was born. And so VAE has foundational pillars using the acronym RISE, coming from Maya Angelou's famous poem, Still I Rise, which draws on a range of influences, including her personal background and the Black experience in this country. And so, of course, I identify with her experience as a Black woman. So therefore, VAE is based on the letters RISE, and the R is research, along with an I, which is an intentional focus that addresses the inclusion of Black people in the electoral process, and then S to support the community, organizations, and the social work profession with research and resources to increase voting and slow down voter suppression, and as a tool for social justice. And then, of course, the E is to engage individuals and communities in the democratic process. And so with that said, the basis of VAE is sort of, you know, to what extent does infrastructure and operations impact a person's ability to vote? And so when we first started doing this, we needed to look at data. You know, I specifically looked at voter turnout data from the 2016 presidential election. And so in looking at that data, we found clear discrepancies between certain populations in St. Louis City and County by ward and zip code. And so I contacted the GIS department, and Aaron at that time was the manager of that department, and also faculty over Brown. And I'd actually worked with Aaron before, but had more to do with mapping, with asset building and financial capability, which is another body of work that I do. But anyway, I was looking for a student who could map this data that we found, because clearly we could see based on numbers that that there was an issue around voter turnout. And so we were able to get maps drawn. And of course, what we saw was nearly half of the turnout in 2016 came from zip codes south of Del Mar, St. Louis City. So, you know, the mapping that data just brings the story to life. And I think that's what we've been hearing, what I've heard from other people on the panel. And so we also use mapping to study the length of time it takes for voters traveling on public transportation to get from work to a poll place. And so what we found is that it generally takes 2 to 2.5 hours one way if you're traveling by public transportation on election day. So it would take you that long just to get from work or possibly picking up your children in order to go and vote. To be specific, the way in which mapping added value for us is to identify those who are marginalized, or what I like to use the term now, multi-marginalized, that are left out of the democratic process. So, and then another way for us to use mapping is to better understand the electorate. You know, if you may or may not be aware, more people voted this time than ever before. And so it's sort of based on what people voted on and who they voted for, and those ballot initiatives that they supported, it makes you kind of wonder, how can we use data to understand the electorate? Why do people vote? You know, what is it that makes them choose a particular ballot measure over the other? The other thing too was just understanding that 73% of young Black people voted for the first time. 90% of Black women voted. There was an increase of white women voters compared to previous elections. And so, so in thinking of terms of also with mapping as a way to identify barriers to voting, to understand again the electorate, to create a space that crosses all social justice issues. And so what I mean by that is talking about those issues or those conditions that people value. Also understanding the systemic racism as a direct link, you know, from slavery and the foundation of inequities of all social and political issues, you know, the racial wealth gap, economic inequality, policing, felony disenfranchisement, criminal justice, poverty, climate change, and healthcare. And of course, you know, racism is at the beginning and the core of all of those things. And so, you know, it's just real important to be able to map and tell that story so that people can see it. So understanding voting at the state and local level and the implications for those that are more likely to suffer from environmental issues, and then identify policies that increase the number of citizens in the electoral process. And so this is a way in which we can continue to make sure that our democracy is healthy and that it continues to thrive, because it can't thrive if it's not practiced, right? So each election cycle is referred to as electoral season, yet voting is a single day event with few exceptions, like absentee and mail-in voting, but data can be used, and these maps can be used to build a compelling reason to make democracy a central theme year round. So in other words, why make it just a seasonal thing? But I think through mapping for social justice, those are just a couple of things. So mapping is also a way to inform ways of accountability to voters in terms of elected, in, in terms of electing officials. And then while most of the country saw an increase in voter registration, our region did not. So for example, in St. Louis City saw close to 7,000 fewer voter registrations than in 2016 presidential election. So, I mean, of course, I could surmise that it was because of COVID and groups could not go out and register people as usual. So the use of real-time mapping may have been an avenue to target specific areas for voter registration campaigns. And so I'm thinking about what data challenges we face. Again, systemic racism is the beginning of everything that is wrong. So if systemic racism is a problem, then what is the question? So without data, the question, the policy solutions cannot be answered. It's imperative to have data to explain the problem and to map those problems in a way that people understand where those problems exist. We know that voter suppression exists. Real-time example is a challenge to ballots cast in urban communities today. So in thinking about other data challenges relevant to our topic, specific individual level voter data by race, county, and or zip code, it just doesn't exist. So when you register to vote here in Missouri, there is no way to ask, or there isn't an opportunity to ask for race or ethnicity on the application. And it doesn't even make it optional. So it would be helpful to know those sorts of things. And so another example is the rejection rate of absentee ballots in St. Louis City for the August election was specific to race. So in St. Louis City, which has and we were able to map this, which has the highest concentration of Blacks, saw an 8% ballot rejection rate compared to Kansas City, which has the next highest population of Black people in the state, which was less than 4%. So you have to wonder why did that happen? And maybe through mapping, we're able to sort of tell that story. But if we have more data that is more individualized data, I think we could create a better situation or better way to map things. And so while I was able to get rejection and absentee data, it was just cumulative numbers without the necessary detail. So the story is incomplete. And so, I just believe that when a story is incomplete, it leads to half-truths. And if we have half-truths, then that leads to bad policy decisions and politicalization of issues that impact our democracy. Also, the best way to get a full picture is to get data from each local election authority and then match it with ACS data to estimate how the number of rejection ballots by county and race line up. We shouldn't have to go through all of that. I think it's stressful. We don't get accurate numbers because we have to do it that way. We have to use census data in order to determine where the number or the highest number of rejected ballots live. So when you think about this, you may ask yourself, well, why is rejection rates, why is that significant? Well, this type of information can inform the local election authority and offer voting advocates in terms of educating voters on how to vote absentee or mail in. The most common reason for absentee ballot rejection in this area was the failure to affix a signature on the return envelope. So again, the goal is to ensure that every citizen has a right to cast a ballot. So if we have maps that can show where there's a concentration of people who have rejected ballots, then that would give advocacy groups and others an opportunity to go to those areas and help educate people, which leads into our final question, which is how to involve the community and or share data with the community. So we use the data that we have to engage the community in deliberative dialogue about ways to engage the community and voters so that they can help themselves design interventions. I'm a firm believer that, as researchers, that it's important to give people the tools and the resources that they need in order to create their own way of change. And also to create a culture of voting, which I think is something that is not currently, it's not something that happens. There just isn't a culture of voting. So we use the data to help organizations advocate for better policies to help people vote. So for example, with the absentee ballot data may support the city in a better design of its absentee return envelope. Because the way that the envelope looks now, it's very compact. The wording is very close together and it's confusing. So if we're able to do that, then we can move on. So the last thing that I'm gonna to say that about this is that the ability to map is just imperative. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gena. So much relevant and timely information for us all. Really, really thank you. Okay, our final speaker before we open up for discussion is Dr. Geoff Ward, Professor of African American Studies, Sociology, and American Cultural Studies at WashU. His scholarship focuses on the racial politics of social control and pursuit of racial justice historically and today. And I will let Geoff take it from here. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's good to be with all of you. It's also, I'm laughing at this photograph because it reminds me of what it was like to get haircuts back in the day. I want to speak to it. I'm going to share a few things as I go through this, but I'm going to maybe start with the question, why important? Why is this important? And I'm, for me, this begins really with my basic interest as a sociologist, why mapping is important in my work in terms of social justice as well. I begin with this sort of basic interest in the organization of social life and the nature of our social world. And spatial and temporal considerations are really vital here. And so mapping plays a critical role in terms of my research in teaching and beyond. John and others mentioned that mapping applications provide perspective and connection to viewers, especially I think John mentioned visual learners. Yeah, I'm one of them. And I remember even really way back to elementary school, the first time I sort of was taught about maps, it just really lit up my brain because I have this visceral memory of this because it was just such a compelling way to think about the world I was a part of. And that's always been the case for me. It's grounding. It really makes the abstract more specific and concrete. And so that's part of the why important story for me. Much of my work focuses on race and justice issues, all of it really, but in a number of ways. And in this area of work, whatever the substantive considerations are, the evidence consistently shows that social contextualization is vital. So in terms of my scholarly work, it's clear, and everyone else has talked about this as well, we need to ground, we cannot understand issues of race and justice without grounding them in terms of time and place. Most of my current work examines histories of racial violence and their legacies, and spatial and temporal considerations are critical here. There's a large body of work that is documenting county level legacies of enslavement and lynching and other racial violence, whereby these area histories help account for contemporary patterns of violent conflict, of violence and conflict and inequality. And it's been shown for a number of outcomes, like incarceration rates or white supremacist mobilization or white political conservatism, all being predicted by histories of lynching and enslavement at the county level. And the list goes on and on and on. My most recent papers show that every additional lynching in the history of a county corresponds with an increase in the odds that all children, and especially Black children, will be corporally punished in schools today. This is a study of 12 Southern states. But this is really more of a county and local story than a statewide story. And mapping is really valuable to demonstrating that. So I've used mapping extensively to understand and also to share these stories. I use mapping in some of my published work, but I've especially been focused on the development of kind of technology tools or digital resources that utilize mapping to encourage broader community engagement with histories and histories of racial violence and their legacies, and the urgency of redress. One of those, I'll just put in the chat now, is this Racial Violence Archive, which is a digital resource that makes this body of work more accessible, but at the center of which is a series of maps that share some of the historical racial violence data that I've been assembling with colleagues and students over the past decade or so. The last thing I want to say about why it's important is because I'm really committed to a public-facing academic practice, and mapping and related applications like story maps really help make my scholarship more visible, useful, hopefully, and ultimately, I hope, impactful. I want to turn now to challenges and what challenges arise in this work. And there's so many of them, but I'll just highlight a few, beginning with some definitional and conceptual challenges. So what are the various forms of racial violence, structural, cultural, and direct, that we can document systematically and think about spatially? Think, for example, of a racist joke. This is something that is almost impossible to systematically document, both its occurrence, but also its circulation spatially and temporally, how it's retold, where it's retold, et cetera. We know this is out there in our social world. We know that it is a form of like epistemic violence, violence to the construction of ideas, but it is not really as accessible to something like mapping as an event like a racial terror lynching, or sorry, this is my third grade class happening at the dining room table here. Hey, Javi. There are sort of conceptual issues as well. How do we locate an event in a county that is, say, occurs in one county, but is perpetrated by a mob that forms in another county? Where do we represent that event spatially? Or how do we represent this complex spatial story? What is the area of impact? We consider the nature of terroristic violence and often extensive participation, thousands of white spectators and participants, aiders and abettors from numerous counties and states often. So what is the geographic scope of what is the geographic scope of the event? Is a problem that arises if you look at the Racial Violence Archive. We don't tell those stories there, but we do grapple with them in some of our published research. Sorry, there's like a prodigy virtual battle or something breaking out in here. I also want to talk about, in terms of challenges, ethical issues, and these are really critical here. And I know they arise in other work that panelists have shared. How do we responsibly represent these events? I choose to aggregate event data often and to avoid the use of family names and horrific narratives and images in this work, because I don't think it's constructive, and I think it can be harmful. We know from other work, for example, that there is a lot of silence around these histories. There's still fear and shame, resentment. And while I want us, the whole point of this is to get us to talk more as a society about our embodiment of historical trauma. The point of the maps is not to reveal to a family that this happened to them, though I do want the resource at some point to be designed in such a way that if someone was looking for that information, they could find it. There are other considerations like vicarious trauma, not only for viewers of the maps and the story maps and so forth, but also for the student research assistants and others who have worked with me on this. And I became really sensitive to this at my previous institution when I was kind of gung-ho, just trying to build this background database and engaging students and assisting me with doing that. And I just noticed how stressful it was for them, and painful particularly for my African-American and Latinx students to just spend all this time with these horrific incidents. So I've been more and more sensitive to those ethical considerations. There are also technical and design issues, of course. I've been learning how to do this work. I'm not, I don't have any until I linked up with folks in data services here, Jennifer and Doris and Bill and others. Molly, have been really instrumental in my learning how to use things like ArcGIS Online and story maps. I've also used trainings with them, have often involved my students so that we can build these tools into courses I teach as sort of components of collaborative and student research projects. I just shared one of those with you. I teach a class called Monumental Anti-Racism, where we're looking at anti-racist commemorative interventions across the world and trying to build a related database. Students come up with design interventions for monuments or memorials, and those are part of the story map. So we build this collaborative work into the class, which also supports my research. I'm really interested in what's going to happen in the wake of the takedown of all of these various Confederate commemorative objects, or universities studying slavery and grappling with the kinds of issues that Marguerite shared and we're grappling with here at WashU. But we need better data on where this is happening, what is happening, to be able to assess down the road what impact all of this has. The last thing I want to talk about quickly is how this work engages community. I mentioned the public-facing commitment to a public-facing academic practice. And I guess what I'd say in terms of engaging community in a general sense is that the projects I've mentioned and shared are organized to engage community through their design and accessibility, in comparison to my more conventional academic work, like published articles and so forth, which are more technical, oftentimes, though not always, typically less accessible because they're behind paywalls and the like. One of the things I do with these sites, like the Racial Violence Archive, is make some of that work available on the site, but also just kind of summarize some of the stories and design projects around them. There are also specific mapping projects I've developed with support from data services to really do very specific, facilitate very specific kinds of community engagement. And the one I'm most excited about here is called Pursuing Justice, which was developed with a lot of help from Doris Scott and others as a resource for a bus tour from St. Louis to Montgomery, Alabama, where the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Archdiocese of St. Louis and others were interested in taking St. Louisans to Equal Justice Initiative's memorial and museum in Montgomery, and asked me to come along as a scholar in residence on the bus. And as I thought about how to do this, I thought it would be really helpful to create a kind of digital triptych for this journey. And so that's what Pursuing Justice is. It really intends to activate the commemorative landscape we'd be traveling through on the way to Montgomery, so that people on the bus were not under the illusion that we needed to wait to get to Alabama to think about these issues. So the map locates things like histories of racial violence, Confederate monuments, Black church burnings, prisons, and so forth. The project was really about addressing mass incarceration. So I use this this mapping application as a resource on the tour. Last thing I'll say, I know I'm out of time, but I just want to mention, Doris helped me build this bus tracker into the site so that in theory, people on the bus could see our bus moving through the landscape. And it ended up not working, I think because of our Wi-Fi or something, and the bus sort of appeared as if it was in the swamp. It was in the, in the river at one point and didn't move anymore. And my wife got worried because she was looking at it, thought the bus had gone off the road or something. But it was a really valuable resource for, I think, everyone on the trip to get more out of that journey, more understanding, and more sense of our responsibility to grapple with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Another wonderful presentation. Officially on our time, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to prioritize your questions from our visitors in the audience. So please feel free to either chat or ask a question. Just unmute yourself and feel free to speak. And as people are warming up, maybe we'll start with, for those of you who didn't have an opportunity to include this in your presentation, maybe you could talk about how your mapping projects, feedback you've received, or indications of how it's impacting the communities that are that it relates to. Caitlin, do you want to address how it's impacted the people who live in the apartments that Cooper lords over?
Sure. So I think I can speak to some people who we were interviewing more closely. As I mentioned, seeing the Cooper's scale of ownership, I think was a often, people would know that their neighbor or their cousin who lived in the area also rented from Cooper or had in the past, or from another landlord that he worked with. And so they know that it's not just their one property that he's working on, but to see the scale of over 200 properties that he had ownership stake in, and close to 200 more where he was managing properties, that scale, I think, sometimes tenants were emboldened by that because they saw the role of speaking up to not just and speaking up and telling their story to not just impact themselves, but all the other people around them, all their other neighbors who were going through similar situations. And because of that, it was important for the map to be included, not just online and in an interactive way that people could shuffle around through it and look at their block, but it was important to publish it in the paper. So there were print copies too. Yeah.
Would anyone else like to address that? Marguerite, have you had feedback from the community that is affected by the work you're doing?
Yeah, and not up to date, so I'd like to know more. But before COVID, we presented this at a couple of different community forums. Actually, in the town during this controversy, there was a documentary that was made by one of the students, and it was displayed at a couple of different forums. So I had some feedback by people who had accessed it, also come to our university to be part of some of our classes, and also anthropology. And one woman who's a leader in our community, she did say that this just opened up her eyes to some possibilities that, she would hope that, school kids, all the way up would start to use it. My idea was, now we'll have some workshops and teach people how to make story maps, and I was very excited about it, but then COVID happened. So what I'm doing is I am using it in my classes. So my classes have projects at the end of the year, so they are using the maps and looking at land use change. So trying to get it out a little bit. One of the students that we had working with us, Aza, she's worked with us for 30 years. So through her time, she came into the University of Georgia. She's a biology major. I kept trying to convince her to be geography, but she loves biology. But I've really just seen her grow in confidence. She's now part of ROTC. So you know, it's a maybe, you know, one person's idea, you know, has been exposed to some technology that would help her in her career. She lives in my neighborhood, and I've talked to her mother, and her mother said that they'll be driving down the road and she'll say, "Mom, that's where the first African-American high school was," or "This was the first church in Athens." And said that they've had some conversations that, you know, they might not have had otherwise. So you know, maybe taking a little while, but I think that it will be, it's open to the public, and hopefully the data itself will be useful to people in the future.
We have a question in the chat. And I would be interested actually, if we can come back to it maybe later, about your students and whether they, like, as Geoff mentioned, experience trauma in the making, but I'm gonna just hold that one for a moment and ask. I'm so sorry. This is for Dr. Marguerite Madden and Dr. Geoff Ward. There seems to be some momentum around House Bill 40 to study proposals for reparations for descendants of slavery. Do you think your work might be great tools to contribute to this proposal process, or just to restorative justice in general?
I could just say quickly, because I'm unmuted. I really hope so. And if I look at the 1925 map at the areas designated as colors, and then I bring up the image from today, and even on the map itself, there is no commerce, there's no industry. You know, the sizes of the houses, the density of the houses is very apparent in the landscape today, and you can see the outline of those designated areas. And then the flip side is there are very few historical buildings remain today. You know, so the areas that were important in African-American residential and cultural history is wiped off the map as well. So hopefully this could provide some quantitative data on the impacts of the Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, I think, you know, I was thinking as we were talking about how, in a sense, some of this work has been filling in for the lack of a national reckoning with these issues, these histories and their legacies. So we have so many of these projects. I mean, I list a number of them on my site, like Refusing to Forget, which looks at anti-Mexican violence in the Texas border region, and Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern Law School, which just had a reparations conference this week, where Ta-Nehisi Coates and Angela Davis and others spoke, but also descendants of lynching victims gathered to talk about how to move forward with reparations. And one of the things, I think, one of the benefits of this work is that it has provided some capacity, some kind of capacity for thinking about the nature of these harms historically. You know, by no means is it a comprehensive account, but we've got some good, I think, models of how in different areas and around specific kinds of questions, we can make sense of this past and its presence, and what reparations might be organized to address, for example. So how do we think, for example, of this descendancy idea, and not only in a genealogical sense, but also in a kind of structural sense, a sense of structural inheritance. Our study of lynching and corporal punishment shows, for example, that if you are, and we also know that histories of slavery relate to patterns of lynching. If you move to one of these counties today, from wherever you were before, you will inherit this structure, the structure of inequality that was shaped by histories of racial violence, including slavery and Jim Crow and so forth. So I think these tools really helpful in framing some of that understanding, and but it can also be, well, I'll stop there. It's complicated. So I'll stop there though.
Thank you. We have another question from panelists, or sorry, from the chat. For any of the panelists, apart from the data quality, that technical or accessibility challenges, what technical or accessibility challenges have you experienced while using GIS software tools? Have those challenges impacted your community outreach efforts?
I guess I can go ahead and start on that one. I think that the biggest technology challenge is just that our desktop is kind of a piece of garbage software built on Visual Basic from forever ago, and they've kind of just been slapping Band-Aids on it. So I know that there's a big push to move everybody into either ArcPro or into Q, depending on kind of what your mindset is as far as what software you prefer. But I think just like the glitchy, buggy software that, you know, will do unexpected things or make you do the same thing 3 or 4 times before you finally get the result you want is just part of the day-to-day frustrations of doing this kind of work. I don't think it's really impacted our community outreach at all. I feel like so much of that really focuses around community conversation around what the final end product looks like is that we really just have to get to that point where we're done screaming about the software that's been frustrating, especially if you're working remotely and using one of these Mac mouses to access your Windows desktop because it screws with Arc quite a bit. And I'll think that I'm actually doing something meaningful and it'll start zooming me in when I don't expect it to and weird things like that. So just a handful of little software glitch sort of things that are really just more frustrations than anything that actually derails any of my projects. So my advice would be to learn a multitude of different GIS software packages, lots of different software tools, and make sure that you're using the right tool for the job and that you understand what the limitations and the frustrations are.
Anyone else from the panel want to address that, or do we have another question?
I guess bouncing off of that, so I created the maps that we used using a tool called Carto just because I wanted to have an interactive digital map that was hosted online so that people could access it more easily. Granted, and then I worked after seeing that it offered this, I worked back and learned the tool, kind of figuring out what its ins and outs were. But often there's a balance between considering who your audience will be. And a lot of times when we were going door knocking, this, you know, a digital map isn't necessarily helpful for when you're on the porch talking with someone. And so we considered the output and in what context you would be reading it, reading the map in, and worked to kind of cater to those experiences in our map output.
I would just add to, you know, I think my feeling is we don't all need to become experts in the use of GIS. I think this is a context where collaboration has really been super valuable to me, and not only with folks in data services, but with, I see Patty Hayda here from Sam Fox School, and I'm looking forward in the spring to working with her colleague Linda Samuels in urban design. And they do amazing work with mapping that, you know, I'm hoping, you know, I know Linda's worked with, and Patty's worked with my colleague David Cunningham, who I've done a lot of work on these issues with over the years. And, you know, we can use these team-based approaches to maximize the benefits of mapping, but also to build other components into various projects. The other thing, I guess, about limitations that I just want to note, is there does seem to be a kind of saturation of these kinds of projects, of digital projects. There's like a bazillion story maps out there, and I wonder about the potential for diminishing kinds of returns on these tools if people come to feel inundated by them, or there's a trade-off in terms of the accessibility. And you know, I don't know what the answer to that is, but this is one of the reasons Linda I mentioned in urban design and I wanted to work together, is to think about, you know, is to begin thinking about composite maps, for example. So how do we create a composite map that would make multiple kinds of stories available in the same, and also overlap between stories available. So instead of having 5 different web maps or whatever you'd have, or story maps, you'd have one with several potential streams that you could look at separately and together. And I'm excited to see what comes of that starting in the spring.
And I'll just add one, we're conscious of these data, these maps that have been scanned are very large files, or hundreds of megabytes in size. So in our map portal, the idea was people can turn things on and off, zoom in, add their own text, draw circles or squares around things, and then print them as PDFs, which would be more accessible. And then if they wanted to download the data, we have the georeferenced original version. We have the ungeoreferenced, the original scan, and then a compressed or a resampled version, which is much smaller in size. And then any GIS data we also have as KMLs that can go into Google Earth if people are used to bringing some data in there. So trying to give of course, you would need internet access to get to the portal in the first place, but maybe just people a very, very basic kind of GIS functions available to just ease into using the data and seeing what's available.
And just to piggyback on all these comments really quick, I think so many of you have brought up an important point. And as a GIS practitioner, you'll often get these data requests, maybe it's from the boss or the public or whatever else, and say, I need you to make a map about this, or map these assets, or map whatever else is going on. It's so very important for us to ask questions like, what is the audience for this? How is it going to be used? Is this something you're sending out via email? Is this something you're gonna want to share with people who are meeting in person, again, back when things are normal, and understand what makes more sense? Because sometimes the printed map is the way to go. Sometimes the digital map is the way to go. Sometimes people really just want data prepared, but they won't always know this. So this is where you have to kind of put on your consultant hat and make sure that the people who are asking you for something know what they're asking for, and that all the expectations are aligned.
Well, we are at our official time. I wonder if there's any burning desires before we wrap up and thank our panelists. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you, panelists. It was such a diverse and wonderful discussion. Very enriching. Really great questions too. And I want to thank all of the people that joined us today. We will make the recording available after this. And please feel free to reach out to data services if you need to get in contact with anyone or you have any questions following this. And if the panelists are open to it, I'm sure you can reach out to them as well. So thank you. Have a wonderful weekend and happy Geography Awareness Week.